Good afternoon, Council and guests today. I'd like to call our public meeting to order on Thursday, February the 18th at 2:00 p.m. And I will go through and do a roll call. Councillor Kittredge has sent his regrets, so he won't be here today. Councillor Foster?
Present.
Councillor Van Leeuwen?
Present.
Councillor McElwain?
Present.
Councillor Dunsmore?
Present.
Councillor McCray?
Here.
Okay, we're here and our mics are working. So ask if there's any disclosure of pecuniary interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. Okay, saying none. Can I get a mover to confirm our agenda that the Council of the Township of Center Wellington confirm the agenda for its meeting held February 18th, 2021? Councillor Dunsmore, second by Councillor Foster. All in favor? And that is carried. So since this is a required public meeting, there is some formality that we have to go through. So I'll just read some of these things out right now. So the purpose of the meeting is to give the public an opportunity to ask questions, provide comments, and make representations on the development charge background study, associated addendums, and the proposed bylaw in accordance with Section 12 of the Development Charges Act 1997, as amended. The categories of services and classes of services for which the development charges are imposed under the proposed bylaw are as follows. Services related to a highway, public works, fire protection services, parks and recreation services, growth studies, wastewater services, and water services. Council will not be making any decisions this afternoon, but the bylaw will be brought forward for Council's consideration at the Monday, March 29th, 2021 Council meeting. The DC background study was made available to the public on December 23rd, 2020. Addendums to the report were made public on January 27th, 2021, Addendum 1, and February 8th, 2021, Addendum 2. Notice of the public meeting was placed in the Wellington Advertiser and posted on the Township website on January 7th, 2021. At this time, I'll ask Dan Wilson, Managing Director of Corporate Services and Treasurer, to introduce the DC background study and introduce Gary Scandlan of Watson and Associates Economists Limited, who will take us through the findings of the study. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Mayor Linton. As Council is aware, development charges is a very important funding source for the township in covering costs related to growth. We're expecting a lot of growth within the township over the next number of years. So this will become critical in making sure that we can provide services to this new population coming into the township. We did do our last DC study in 2018. Some members of council will be aware of that. It just happened, I guess, just prior to the municipal election. At that point in time, we only had the fire services master plan complete. So it was known at that time that a number of other master plans needed to be completed and rolled into the development charge background study at a later date. So that would be the primary reason for the update we're doing this year. We normally do updates every 5 years, but this is an exception given that there's significant changes to the calculation itself. So we now have updated master plans for transportation, water supply, and parks, recreation, and culture. So they've been built into the DC calculation. As well, we're extending out growth to 2041 in the calculation. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Gary Scandlan from Watson and Associates to go through the public presentation.
Welcome, Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's a pleasure to be here with council again. I'm not quite clear whether the clerk or Dan are running the presentation or whether I should. I don't think it was clarified.
I'll ask our clerk about that. Carrie, do you know who's?
Well, it's totally up to you, Gary. If you want to share your screen, you have the capability to do that.
All right, that'd be great. Share the screen. And I assume everybody can see that now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. And there we go. Okay. So this, as a good introduction, Mr. Mayor, you've given all the proper background. Obviously, as part of a mandatory process for transparency under the Development Charges Act to ensure that presentation is made to the public and the opportunity to receive any questions and feedback on the proposed charges. Similar to every other public meeting, you open, you close the session. In between, there's a presentation and then questions which may arise from the public or council. This public process that the Act sets out requires the release of the background study, and between the time the study is initially released, there must be a minimum of 60 days before council can consider the bylaw. And in between that time is when we have the public meeting. This just sets up the timelines that we've worked with staff. So we initiated the process last year and have moved through to review the different master plans, have discussions with staff, have discussions with some of the engineering firms that have been assisting in the area of water, wastewater, and roads. And then we released the background study. And as you've indicated, Mr. Mayor, there's been two addendum reports to refine this. We would be seeking council's consideration of the bylaw on March the 29th. Development charges have been around for over 60 years now. They were initially under the Planning Act back in the mid 1950s. And when they put that into play, there was a number of Ontario Municipal Board cases, challenges to that, which over the next 30 years established a lot of case law on which would guide us to undertake these calculations. As of 1989, the province took all of those case law decisions and have basically weaved it into a Development Charges Act. So the first one was in 1989. But since that time, there's been a number of adjustments and refinements leading up to most recently under Bill 108 and Bill 197, there was further changes to the legislation. So that allows us now to update the development charges in conjunction with the latest and greatest. Sorry, I'm just having a problem. Just a second here. There we go. I was having a problem with the everybody's faces blocking my presentation here. So most recently, what we've seen, as I've noted, is considerable changes to the development charges legislation. And you may recall, initially there was Bill 108 called the More Homes, More Choice Act. And that was released in draft early May 2019. And within approximately 32 days, it was the act was given royal assent. And all of the regulations and such weren't put into play to effectively include, at least for development charges, the implementation of a lot of those changes. And then the Development Charges Act through discussions with Municipal Working Committee, of which Nancy, my colleague, was on that committee as well. And through over the next year and a half, we went through a number of changes. Bill 197 finally was put into play in September of last year. And most recently, we had a further change, which actually provided an exemption for universities. Where we've ended up with the legislation is that they've now allowed only certain services to be considered under the development charge bylaw. Historically, it was you could charge whatever service you provided, with the exception of certain things such as not providing for town hall space, parkland acquisition, most cultural services, grants to hospitals. Those were exempted. And what they've done now is they've changed it around and said, you can't impose a charge for unless we tell you what service you're allowed to include. So you can see with this updated list, these are the services that can be included now within a development charge. All other services basically are eliminated. Now there's a couple of areas, and we'll touch base on this, that we do get a little bit of latitude. Let's say for planning studies, you can see that planning's not included in here. But for those planning studies that historically we've included, what we can do is to consider that those something like an official plan establishes policies with respect to water, wastewater, transportation, and other services. So we can still include something like official plan studies, but we have to categorize it within this new definition, which is called class of services. So there's at the end of the day, perhaps you won't see the differences, however, in those classes. But for Nancy and myself, we have to go through more steps in order to allow you to continue to collect for those type of capital costs. When we noted that the Bill 108 came out, and actually they introduced a sizable amount of change to the legislation. In fact, they were only going to allow initially 8 services to be provided for, and then everything else was going to be put under this community benefit charge, this CBC. And over the next year and a half of dialogue, basically at the end, you can see that the province basically rescinded its initial thoughts and ended up putting in 21 services into the D.C. And they've reduced or eliminated a lot of the cost recovery under that community benefit charge. Basically, that charge is only for high density developments, 5 stories and larger. And it has to include at least 10 residential units or more, but no less than 10. And then at the end of the day, all you can charge is up to 4% of the market value of the land the day before you pull the building permit. So they've ended up expanding the development charge, but reducing considerably what was going to be considered under that community benefit charge. Now, what they did do implement through Bill 108 was an allowance for certain types of developments to mandatorily pay the municipalities in installments. So if you have a rental housing or an institutional development, then you are allowed to pay in 6 installments. And basically with the rental housing or institutional development, it's upon occupancy where you have to make your first payment. So it's not at building permit. If I'm building, you know, a 200 unit rental apartment, I would pull my building permit now, and maybe it's 2 years before I complete that building. And I would end up paying the charge at the time of occupancy. And then from that, I'm only paying 1/6. And then each year on the anniversary, I would pay the residual 5 payments. For nonprofit housing, they allow those payments to proceed over 21 payments, or basically 20 years. Now with that, the province has at least recognized the value of money, so that over time, your costs are going to increase, or the charge, will be affected by, at a minimum, by inflation. So they allow you to provide interest against those payments. So you can basically, to some extent, increase the charge every year based on the interest rate that you've selected. Now, they've also done a similar type of thing for applications that come through for site plan or for zoning. And what they've said there is the day that I come in to the municipality with a completed application for site plan or zoning, the development charge is frozen at that particular point. So the charge, whatever is in effect at that point, is then frozen until I receive approval of my site plan or zoning application. And then after that, from that day, I have a further 2 years to basically move forward with the development. And if I do so, then that frozen rate, which you can add basically interest to, is basically, that's the rate that I would pay. The original amount inflated for X number of years, and then on that basis is what I would pay. So they've allowed that for site plan and zoning bylaw amendments. And it's, once again, it's based on the date that you receive a completed application. Now, Bill 197 was really where the completion of this exercise got put into place. And this is where they implemented the eligible services. So there's 21 services I provided for a couple of slides back. This new definition of classes of services, which would allow me to basically still recover many of the growth-related studies that may be provided through planning, let's say. They've removed the mandatory 10% deduction. So historically, for the softer services, we get down to all of these different calculation deductions, and at the end, we knock off an extra 10%. So they've allowed that 10% to be removed. So we no longer have that as part of our calculation. And then the last thing was we were limited to a 10-year planning horizon for all services. All services except for water, wastewater, storm, roads, police, and fire. What they've done now is to basically remove that 10-year planning horizon for almost every service. The only one that it still applies to today is transit. That's because when they made adjustments to the transit calculations 5 or 6 years ago, they put into play a very unique calculation. So it still has that mandatory 10-year planning horizon that we have to stick to. So in many areas, they've given us additional flexibility. And then in other areas, they basically removed some of the financial recoveries that we could have made historically. I made comments earlier that they also introduced that community benefit charge. That's a separate process, separate from the development charge background study process. There's one that's, it almost mirrors the development charge process, but it's for this special charge. And that charge would allow you to recover any services that aren't included in the development charge. We can include in this CBC. Once again, it's not a big ticket item. It's limited to a maximum of 4% of the value of the land for those higher density developments. So right now, our study that we've just completed does not include this at this particular point. That's something that staff want to consider further, and they'll be back to seek council's guidance in the future, whether we want to put into play that additional type of charge for high density. I just note that just about 2 months ago, there was a further bill that was introduced which affects the development charge, and basically it eliminated or it put into play an exemption for your university and colleges. But basically, those universities or colleges have to be funded by senior levels of government, and that's the trigger. Just because you call yourself a college, or I call myself the University of Watson, doesn't mean that I get an exemption. I have to be funded by the senior levels of government in order to have my buildings or facilities exempted. we don't expect that this will impact the township in any way, at least over the short to medium term. The Development Charges Act lays out required steps that we have to go through. This is very simplified, but in essence, what it's trying to establish is identify your growth forecast, so the amount, type, location of the growth. Take a look at the servicing needs for all those different areas and the amount of growth that you're going to have. And then establish the cost of putting the new infrastructure in play. And then once we have those costs, there's 3 or 4 deductions, grants or subsidies, to which these days there's not a lot available. Consider any direct benefit to the existing development. We have to do historic service standard calculations. You'll see that in Appendix B. These are mathematical calculations that we have to do under the Act. So when we talk level of services for the DC, it's a mathematical calculation that looks historically 10 years. We use quality. At the end of the day, we come up with a ceiling, an upper limit for each service that we can't exceed. And then lastly, moving from one bylaw to the next, we have to rationalize any balances in the reserve funds. So that leaves us with a net cost. We must allocate between res and non-res benefit, and then basically divide it through the growth to calculate the charge. So in the simplest forms, we look at the costs associated with infrastructure to service the growth. We basically divide it by the growth that we anticipate over, let's say, the next 10, 15, 20 years. And through some calculations, we come up with a charge on the residential side, which is for low, medium, high density development. So there's separate charges. And then on the non-residential side, we impose it on a per square foot of building space. So if I'm building a 10,000 square foot building, whatever the rate is in the bylaw times my 10,000 square feet represents the amount of the charge that I would pay for my building. When all councils are considering the proposed charges, there's always a balance that councils seek to make. As you proceed, the top oval talks about as growth occurs, there's pressure to put into place additional infrastructure to support that growth. For water and wastewater, we're putting in pipes, we're putting in supply, putting in treatment. We may be identifying additional parks, additional recreation facilities, et cetera. So those costs normally arise because of the growth that occurs in the municipality. Once we identify those costs, there's no magic. You don't have to have a development charge, but if you don't recover it from growth, then all of the infrastructure costs move over and they're funded through existing property taxes or your water and your wastewater rates. So in essence, your existing population and businesses end up providing some level of subsidy to new growth for paying for all of this new infrastructure. So I know there's always this balance and this trade-off as we go through this process. One of the things I'd point out is there's this came in 2015, or it's kind of always been there, but it's been more, there's more rules and regulations around it today, but they introduced this concept of no additional levies. And basically what that means is that you're not allowed, it prohibits municipalities from imposing additional payments, so charges in addition to the development charges that bylaw, or requiring construction of a service that's not authorized under the D.C.A. So it's limiting your ability to impose added costs or impose the requirement to construct additional infrastructure. But what it does say is that we're allowed to identify what localized services are. And those local services are basically paid for by the developers. So that would be basically all of the services internal to a subdivision, internal water mains, sewers, roads, street lights, sidewalks. We would define that those are the developer's costs. The Development Charges Act then take into play these costs that are outside of the subdivision. And once we rationalize that, you're limited where you cannot then come back and impose charges in excess of that. So what we've done is we've provided within the background study a definition for water, wastewater, storm, roads, parkland dedication, what the rules are, what are the developers, what are they going to pay for 100% as part of their development. And then outside of that, that's what we're including in the development charge calculations. You can see the growth forecast. We're about 9,200 people over the 10-year planning horizon and over 20,000 going out to 2041. And that translates into roughly 3,600 units in the 10-year or a little over 8,000 in the longer term forecast. When we look at water and wastewater services, obviously they're specific to your more urbanized areas. So there is a little bit of growth outside of those areas, but the predominance is in those urban core. And you can see the growth is about 19,800 people over that long-term period. You can see on the bottom, we've provided the non-residential square footage that's been forecasted for those different planning horizons. And if we look schematically on the growth, you can see that the black represents the historic building activity for residential, so your housing units. And you've averaged somewhere in the range of about 160, 170 units per year. The forward forecast would see a higher amount of development. So ranging and averaging over the next 10 years in and around 290 to 300 people per year. And then post that period, a slightly higher forecast ranging from 325 to over 400 units per year. So a sizable amount of development that's been anticipated. And if you look at the color coding there, how that mix of housing units is represented is the largest amount is your low density, so single, semi-detached. Medium density is represented in the mid-gray, and the orange is your high density development. Services that we're providing are basically the same as what you've had in the past. Services related to a highway, which is roads, active transportation. So that would be included in services related to highway. We've got fire, parks and rec. And those services would be collected township wide. So not only in the urban areas, but as well into the rural areas. And you can see continuing on that municipality wide type of charge, we've got, I talked a little bit about classes. We have classes of services for public works, and we have classes of services for growth related studies. So you'll see these two different categories as well in your existing bylaw. But we've had to categorize them as a class because some of the nuances of the changes they've recently made. Just in the urban area, we have a water and a wastewater charge for where you're receiving the direct municipal service. Historically, there's been exemptions that are mandatory. Not a lot, but they've allowed industrial development. So if you have an existing industrial building, they've allowed you to expand that building by up to 50% with no DC being payable. If you exceed that sizing, then you would pay for the increment past the 50%. There's a local government exemption. So the county, the local municipalities, the school boards can impose their charges on each other. So it's a local government exemption. The third significant bullet there just talks about if I have a single family home, I'm allowed to add up to 2 additional apartments in my home. And as long as I don't more than double the size of the home, then I don't have to pay a development charge for those 2 units. If you're in a medium density or high density development, then you would get 1 additional unit. The last significant bullet is what they've just recently added as part of the legislation change. So now when you come forward, if I'm building a brand new single family home or a semi-detached or even a townhouse, I'm allowed to either add 1 additional unit in my single family or that type of unit. So I can, have a single family home and also include an apartment in the basement. And I don't have to pay a development charge on that additional unit. Now, you're allowed to either have an additional unit inside the new unit, or you're allowed to have an accessory unit, say a granny flat. So you're allowed one or the other, either something inside that new dwelling unit or accessory to that new dwelling unit. So that's brand new. With any of these exemptions, basically the municipality has to contribute the lost revenue to offset the loss for these exemptions. Now, there are opportunities through the Act for council to consider additional exemptions. We categorize those as discretionary or non-statutory exemptions. And that may be to exempt or reduce the charge for certain types of development or certain classes of development. A class would be, let's say, industrial development. Types of development may be places of worship. We can phase the charge in over time if we want. And as well, there are redevelopment credits to recognize that if I knock down my house, I should be allowed to replace it over a period of time. Or let's say if somebody's knocking down as a development 3 single detached and they're putting up 10 townhouses, they get recognition for the original 3 houses that were there. So you'd pay 10 times the medium density and you'd subtract 3 times the low density rate and just pay the net increment. So those are the ones that are mandatory. With your particular situation, you've always exempted the place of worship. You've exempted non-residential farm buildings for bona fide farm uses. And then you've provided exemptions within basically the Fergus and Laura downtown core. So that's for residential units that are located above commercial buildings and as well. So the non-residential charge of the water and the wastewater would be exempted for those areas. Now we've, for this particular bylaw, we have made some refinements. You can see the first 2 bullets we've continued. Well, actually the first 3 bullets we've continued. And then we've added silos for industrial, commercial, and institutional uses, and shipping containers for industrial, commercial, and institutional have been added as exemptions to the bylaw. The redevelopment policy, which has normally been set at a 5-year planning horizon, we have continued that for all developments except for brownfields, and they'll be allowed up to 25 years sunset clause because it normally takes longer to demolish a building, rehabilitate the site. There's normally a fair amount of investment. So a lot of municipalities have provided longer periods of time to recognize those type of developments. Need a bit more time to actually bring the full development to bear. Your current charges, you can see the listing of the services. The townwide charges for a single detached currently are just over $15,000, and there's about $9,200, $9,300 for water and wastewater. brings your total to about 24,364. You can see as we move across from left to right, the sizing of the units actually gets smaller and smaller and smaller, either multiples or your medium density. Then we provided for apartments, large apartments, small, and then some special dwelling units, which really are to recognize things such as, seniors housing, seniors homes that like a Chartwell type of development. So they have very small number of persons per unit. So we've provided a calculation for that as well. The last column just gives you your non-residential charge. So it's $3.63 for municipal wide charges, and then a little over $3 for the water wastewater, totaling about $6.69 per square foot. The proposed rates that are in place would see somewhat of an increase over the current charges. So the proposed charges for a single would rise from about just under $24,300 to almost $24,800. And then you can see correspondingly the charges are adjusted as we go down. On the non-residential side, the charges are $8, just over $8 per square foot. So the study was done in 2020. So the costs are based on the charges in effect at that time. But for purposes of implementation, the charges will actually be represented in 2021 dollars. So they'll actually be $25,420. So that would be approximately $1,000 increase over the charges in currently covered under the bylaw. And you can see once again, correspondingly, the charges go down for those residential units as from left to right. So some of the things that are a little bit more informative for this study, I think as noted, we've gone out to 2041 for our growth and the corresponding servicing, where before we were looking at 2031. The master plans, as the treasurer indicated, Dan identified that we've had additional master plans available to service those population targets. And then on top of that, we've had Triton Engineering assisting us with the harder services in identifying the capital projects, the capital needs, and is assisting us to some extent on interpreting transportation master plan costs. We've initially released the report in December, and you can see initially the rate would have been approximately $27,000, but we've made a couple of adjustments through the two addendums, and the charge actually has moved from the $27,000 range down to just below $25,000. And you can see the areas where those changes occurred. So there was some adjustments to some of the projects what we had, some of the costings, some of the deductions. There was an adjustment to the growth forecast in the urban areas. So through these this process, as we went back through, reviewed our calculations with staff, reviewed our calculations with the engineering individuals, we've made these adjustments over time. You can see on the non-residential side, similar type of thing where these adjustments have correspondingly been made as well. Looking at the township's charges relative to others. So we've given you basically Wellington County. We've looked at places such as Dufferin County. We've looked at Waterloo region, and we've tried to give you a good perspective of a broader area. And you can see you're a little right of center, and you can see the charges are basically not changing your position relative to other areas. You can see the highest charges are within Waterloo region. City of Guelph is as well higher than yourselves. And then you can see that for your comparable, a little bit higher than any of the other municipalities in the county. Looking at the non-residential charges, this is commercial. You can see once again, you're at the the right side of center and comparable to lower than Guelph and generally comparable to others in the county. And then on the industrial side, you can see similar type of occurrence as well. So the next steps with council's indulgence, we would be back for your consideration of the bylaw at the end of March to adopt the a new bylaw for these charges. That completes my presentation, Mr. Mayor. I'm happy to hand it back to you.
Great, thanks very much, Gary, for that in-depth report and all the work you guys put into this. I know there's no delegations scheduled for this meeting, but I just want to ask if there's any members of the public who haven't registered who won't wish to speak to this. Okay, done. So in that case, I will turn it over to questions, comments from council. I'll start with Councillor Foster, please.
No questions, Mayor. Thank you.
Councillor Van Leeuwen.
No questions. It's quite a report and quite a process to get through this all, but it's very interesting to see how we get through it. And development charges are definitely important, so it doesn't weigh onto the tax burden. But getting it right is important. So thanks for this.
Councillor McElwain.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a few little questions. The annual increase is based upon the NRB CPI, I believe. And I'm just curious, does the calculation include all charges? Because there are many parts of the development charges that are not construction related. Do they still get increased by the construction index? Because I know that you have, your company has recommended that not happening for asset management. So I'm just wondering, is that what happens with development review or development charges as well?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's a good question. The Development Charges Act mandates that if you're going to adjust the charge with inflation, we have to use that particular construction cost index. So we really don't have a lot of latitude on that. We have to use it. Now, just as a little bit of background, what the stats can try and do is survey municipalities as well as businesses and try and get some estimate of how tender prices will change from year to year. So it's not just a change in salaries and wages or materials. It also recognizes that during very buoyant economic times, that rate increase can be much higher than a CPI. And then during an economic downturn, you may see a very low or even a negative adjustment to that index.
Councillor McElwain, anything else?
Yes, please.
Okay.
This question is probably for Dan. Just one of the points that Gary made during his presentation was that we don't charge development charges for other levels of government, et cetera. And this has never crossed my mind in previous development charge discussions, but does that mean that all the development that's going to be happening eventually and on the county lands in Aboyne happens without any development charges and we foot the bill for any infrastructure costs there?
Yeah, through Mayor Linton, Yeah, to the extent that the county does initiate development, we are enabled to charge development charges to the county. So that is unfortunately the case from a growth perspective as per the D.C. Act, but we're looking at future discussions with the county on how to handle that.
Councilor McElwain, you have anything else, sir? No? Okay. Councilor Dunsmore?
No, I want to thank Gary and his group for a thorough report. When you look at how much legislation you guys had to juggle to put all this together, it's a phenomenal amount of information, but I appreciate everything you brought. I've got no questions.
Councilor McCray?
Thank you, Mayor Linton. I echo Councillor Dunsmore's sentiments. Very comprehensive and thorough document to explain the process. Certainly enjoyed reading and understanding how you arrive at the numbers. I have two questions. One is related to the proposed DC charges for special care, special dwelling units. I've noticed that they've increased significantly from current rates, and I'm just wondering why. Considering we're probably going to need more of these special care, special dwelling units going forward as our population ages.
Through the mayor, the basis for the charges has always been on number of persons per unit. So that for the most part, you've got about 1.1, 1.2 on average person in these types of units. So the charge has gone, from what I can see here, we're from about $5,000 to about $8,000. The largest charge really is in the urban service area. It's the water and the wastewater charges. They're the ones that we've seen increase the most. The rest of the services basically did increase, but not to quite the same extent.
Okay. And then the other one is related to the wastewater services. I guess the non-residential charges per square foot, they were like $2.06. They're now $1.73. I'm just thinking with our plans for future wastewater treatment plant expansion and additional infrastructure to accommodate growth, I'm wondering why it dropped rather than sort of stay around the level it is currently.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, a couple of different things. We've, within the calculations, we in part have the advantage of updated master plan studies, which has given us some insight into flow allocations on the non-residential side. And then on top of that, there's also been the amount of growth, depending on whether you're commercial, you're industrial, or you're institutional. There's a different amount of square footage, which is associated with the number of employees. So it's kind of a blend, number one, on making an adjustment with respect to the flows per employee. And the second part is the adjustments that are made when we're doing the demographic forecasts.
Still sounds a little confusing to understand, but thank you.
Any other questions, comments from council at this time? Okay, so there being no further questions from council or the public, I declare this public meeting concluded. And the deadline for the receipt of written responses is March 8th, 2021. At that, and council will be considering the bylaw at its March 29th, 2021 council meeting. So with that, I want to firstly, before we adjourn, thank Gary, thank Nancy, thank Dan and his team, and the whole group at Center Washington for pulling this together. It's a pretty rigorous process to go through a development charges study. So appreciate all the work that was done on this. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Thanks. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.